Dr. Annette Feravich from Healthy Mind, Body, Spirit, and you can find us on the internet at www.healthymindbodyspirit.net. Today I'm bringing you the fourth video in our series on self-esteem, and this video, as promised, is on emotions. If you recall from our previous videos, our first video was on cognitive dissonance. Now, cognitive dissonance is actually a motivator for an emotional response to self-esteem. We feel bad when our attitudes don't match our behaviors. So, in other words, we feel bad when we behave in hypocritical ways. There are many ways that can be brought to our attention, but when it is, we typically feel bad about our behaviors. In our second video on self-esteem, we talked about biases. And if you recall, what we said about biases is that biases are the cognitive component to self-esteem. So sometimes we feel something about our self-worth. Sometimes we think something about our self-worth. And so our biases are the way that we think about our self-worth. And in reality, what biases are the ways that we distort reality in order to see things, and in particular ourselves, in a favorable way. And one of the biases that we all engage in is what's called a bias blind spot. That is, that we think everybody else falls victim to biases, but we do not. When we admit that we fall victim to these biases, what that does is it reduces our feelings of self-worth. And that is the emotional component to self-esteem, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. And so how is self-esteem related to our feelings of self-worth? Well, one thing that we know about self-esteem is that we can actually improve our self-esteem by derogating or putting down another person. So this is very interesting, right? How do we improve our self-esteem? One way is by putting down other people. Maybe not the best way, though, to improve our self-esteem. Another way that we improve our self-esteem is through social comparison. And we can do an upward social comparison with other individuals, or we can do a downward social comparison with other individuals. Downward social comparison is that we compare ourselves to people who are worse off than we are, right? And so it's another sort of variation on putting other people down. What we do is we highlight the deficits in other people. So that's a downward social comparison that we can engage in. We can also engage in an upward social comparison to make ourselves feel better. An upward social comparison is when we compare ourselves to people who are better off than we are. Now, you might think that that's going to make me feel worse if I compare myself to people who are better than I am. But actually, in many circumstances, that actually ends up motivating us to behave in particular ways. So let's say that we want to be a star basketball player. And so what we do is we compare our skills to somebody who's significantly better than us, like Michael Jordan. Now, for many of us, that might make us feel worse about ourselves. You can see that how we vary the distance of the person we're comparing ourselves to can also influence the feelings that we have about ourselves. We might compare ourselves to somebody who is significantly better than us, like Michael Jordan at basketball, or we might compare ourselves to somebody who is just a little bit better than ourselves, like maybe our boss, for example. And then what we do is we are motivated to aspire to be more like that individual. And so that motivation and goal setting actually improves our self-esteem. So there are two other ways then that we can change our self-esteem: through upward comparison with people who are better than us and that motivate us to do better, or downward comparisons when we compare ourselves to other people who are worse off than ourselves. Now that brings us to an important point that I want to make about self-esteem, and that is there a better way or a best way to improve our self-esteem? Is it better to do upward comparisons? Is it better to do downward comparisons? What I want to do right now is talk to you about another theory which is called terror management theory. And this will give you an indication about how self-esteem can play on our fears and anxieties. Terror management theory is a theory that when our lives are in jeopardy, what we end up doing is adhering more closely to our value system. And so what that means is not only our value system we tend to express more, but also we end up uniting more often with people who have the same beliefs as we do. So, for example, on 9/11, 2001, what we ended up seeing is a lot of interesting psychological phenomenon. So as a country, what we did was we united together and we formed alliances with people who were American, and we also formed enemy groups with those people who were terrorists. So what we ended up doing is recalling and then adhering to our very strong values that at that time were related to being an American citizen. And in doing so, we increased our self-esteem. That cooperation made us feel better about ourselves as we realized and called into memory our most important values. We call that terror management theory. But what we clearly see here that's related to self-esteem is the making of in-groups and out-groups. I feel better about myself when I look more like and behave more like my in-group. I also see that I can feel better about ostracizing the out-group, derogating them, putting them down. So then the question becomes, for my emotional well-being, how is it best to increase my self-esteem or feelings of self-worth? In our next video on self-esteem, we're going to talk a little bit more about what are the best ways to increase feelings of self-worth and to increase our self-esteem. This is Dr. Annette Feravich with Healthy Mind, Body, Spirit, and thank you for joining us on our video series on self-esteem. Please remember to subscribe to my YouTube video. You can click on the subscription icon right below this video and make sure that you visit my website, healthymindbodyspirit.net, and I will see you on our next video series on entity versus mastering. Which one improves your self-esteem more?